Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense, the bullshit. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills for that pussy. He was a big, beefy man like a cow with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Miss Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the amount of usual neck, which came in very useful, as she spent so much of her time on her knees, craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley. And in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. Not even at the gay clubs. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret. And their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they haven't met for several years, in fact. Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleys-ish as if it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew they had a Potter of a son, too, but they have never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up that dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky. Can you pour me a shot?
Yeah, I got you, man. Give me a second.
About the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things. Mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into a high chair. None of them noticed a large brown owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley in the cheek with his cock, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley knows fucking how to. Wait, what's that thing called when you dodge the moves in Smash?
Spot dodge?
He spot dodged that shit so good. Because Dudley's a fucking Smash champion. And he threw cereal all over the walls. Little Tyke chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. Like he backed out of his wife's ass. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his cock around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking? It must have been a trick of the light. Or all the fucking Molly he's taken. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back into his soul, and Mr. Dursley drove around the corner up the road. He watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that No! It was looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. They're fucking cats. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake. A little shake. And put the cat out of his mind and into his bag. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a very large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people around. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw in young people. He supposed this was some kind of new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a hundred of these weirdos standing close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see what a couple of them. They weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. He's probably a Slytherin. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably a kind of silly stunt, you know? These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived in Grunning's parking lot, his mind back on drills. Drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl pooped, sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at nighttime. That's because they don't go out at night. They watch the news and go to sleep. Fucking boring mother. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in very, very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs, his big, beefy legs, and walk across the road to buy himself a walk across the road. Like, that's the fucking stretch for this man. He will walk across the road and then go back. What a stretch. What a beef of a man.
My man had a hard life, man.
He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the bakers. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters! That's right, that's what I heard! Yes, their son Harry! Mr. Dursley started dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something, but he bitched out at the last second. He dashed across back the road, hurried up to his office, locked at the secretary, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized the telephone, and almost finished dialing home until he realized he's a bitch. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache. His big, beefy mustache, thinking no, he was being stupid. Potters weren't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure if his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. He might have been Harvey or Harold. Harold Potter, that's the one. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, the people in cloaks. Hold on a second.
Want another shot? Hey, you want
Oh, fuck. No, I'm good now.
You sure?
Alright, pour me another.
Okay.
Just pour me a...
Jesus Christ. I'm gonna use your wit. Oh.
Alright.
I'll give it to Johnny. Johnny? Sure. Okay.
He found it a lot hard. What the fuck is this? Oh, God, Johnny.
You'll walk through it, man.
Johnny, please. Oh, God.
Johnny helps you walk away. You walk away. He walks too.
He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon as his secretary came in and... never mind. When he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted. Wait, that's the beefy man. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being knocked almost to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passersby stare. Oh, fuck.
Your fortune is yours.
Don't be worried, sir, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like you should be celebrating this happy, happy day. And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood right at the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger in ages. He also thought he'd been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled like a snake. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. Imagination is for scrubs. Imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. What are we at? 11 minutes. How long?
How many pages you have left?
Too many. And this is where we stop for today, kids. I'll see you next time. I'm your host, Homer Simpson.
Homer Pirate.
Homer Pirate?
Homer Pirate.
I still have to make... Good night.
Pirate. Good night, everybody. Sweet dreams.
I love you.